Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the Stick to the Script podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Peralez, and we'll be starting off today's episode by interviewing a guest, a colleague, a fellow writer that I've invited to the show to discuss one of the new movies that we'll be taking a look at on our podcast, Obsession. Hi, hello. How are you doing this evening?
Hi, I'm good.
I'm good too. Thank you. I wanted to invite you on the show today to kind of talk about the writing process and discuss, a movie in particular that just came out. So I wanted to ask you if you've seen the movie Obsession that just came out in theaters.
I have, yes.
What were some things that you felt worked about the movie that made you like it?
The movie's called Obsession, and based off of the plot line of this story, you think that it's gonna be about, this girl who's obsessed with this guy, but in reality, you find out that the person with the obsession is the guy himself, and he's obsessed with the girl, which is why he ends up making the wish in the first place for her to be in love with him. And so I really feel like, that twist in the title and everything, and then, how they call back in the movie, like scenes where, we get glimpses of the actual Nikki and not the possessed Nikki, and how we can kind of see that she's not herself and that she's not in her own body, that she's almost like possessed by this other being. And kind of how we start to see Bear become the villain in the story as opposed to her, where we see, she's trying to say, like, it's not me, like, help me. And he's basically still kind of like, oh, well, like, what's so bad about being with me? Just kind of the way that they captured that. And yeah, I feel like they had a very, very skilled team of writers on that movie. And I feel like there was no wasted scenes throughout that entire movie.
Yeah, I mean, I would heavily agree with that analysis, especially the no wasted scenes thing. I feel like the mark of great writing is just how tight and efficient it can be. Because one of the biggest enemies of a writer is redundancy and things that pretty much just add fluff but not really any meaning. So I think this movie definitely excelled at that. I think that there was some really good complex, character work and plot work going on there to make it so that some of the moral ambiguity and things that you wouldn't initially guess upon seeing the trailers, because like you said, the movie markets itself as like like the girl Nikki is like obsessed with the guy, and she's like the monster, and she's the kind of the driving force of everything bad in the movie. But then when you start to read between the lines and everything, and then you understand that it was the guy Bear's selfish actions that made her like that in the first place, and everything she's doing is against her own will. So yeah, I really think that the script writers, I think they did a fantastic job of layering all sorts of different meanings. I mean, there was some really good character work um, throughout this whole movie. Obviously, I think the best example was with the protagonist who, you know, you come out watching. Initially, he seems like, just a nice, like, well intentioned, hopeless romantic guy. And as the movie goes on, you see, that takes advantage of the situation and, kind of just does things for his own benefit. But I was wondering if you could share with our guests today kind of what your character creation process looks like as we're delving into these elements of what makes great writing great.
Yeah, of course. When I'm creating a character, I want to know my character. I want them to feel like a real person to me. So, when I'm looking at creating a character for a story, that's where I start. I I oftentimes, before I even have a fully fleshed out story, I'll already be thinking about my character, you know. And I find too that knowing your character helps you create the story that you want to write. And, you really can build off of that. So I always like to create a template from all of my characters that I create. Get to know them like they're a real person, first name, middle name, last name, how old they are, their date of birth, where they were born, family members, friends, if they have any, like their appearance, if they have any tattoos, piercings, the kind of clothes that they wear, what they look like appearance wise is like how they cut and style their hair color, eye color, any like birthmarks, any sort of like scars, any unique features on their body, that kind of thing. And then, I also like to dive into their story too, like what are their goals? What are their biggest strengths? What are their biggest weaknesses? I wanna know my character on the same level that I know myself. So, I really try to I use a lot of inspiration from characters of stories that I've read. I use a lot of inspiration from people in my life that I know from, myself. I feel like in a lot of ways, the characters that I write, I can see them almost as a reflection of myself in a way, which I think, that really helps in the getting to know your character aspect. But I feel like that's really the most important part is knowing your character. Seeing them as if they're a real person, like they're a friend, like they're somebody that you know on like a deep, intimate level, because ultimately that's where the heart of your story is gonna be. And when you're writing a character, you need to make your reader feel like they're a real person.
I think that that's a great approach. I remember the first time that you showed me your template for creating a character. I was blown away because there were so many different aspects that I'd never even thought of, and I think that's why in your writing your characters feel so real and everything like that. So I appreciate you sharing that. I really appreciate that perspective and everything. And I really appreciate all the insight that you've given us today during this interview.
Of course. I'm happy to help. I'm happy to be here and discuss with you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Know that all the young listeners we have are going to appreciate it as they take your advice on their journeys. So yeah, I had a great time discussing the movie with you and delving into different writing strategies. I really appreciated you taking your time to come onto the show and talk a bit.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Josh.
Of course, thank you. All right,
Of
you have a
course.
great night.
You too. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
As we go into the solo narrative section of this episode now, one of the things I want to dive a little deeper into was when I was talking with Hallie about the layering of the movie, the way that the script has all sorts of different twists and turns and things you don't really necessarily expect upon first viewing or initial impressions. And especially with first viewing, I know for me, having seen it twice, there's things that I didn't catch the first time around that I only caught upon seeing the movie a second time. One of those things was just how deep the movie goes into portraying Bear, the main character, as a hero at first. The typical protagonist, well intentioned, shy, awkward, hopeless romantic. They really try and sell him as that early on. But upon watching it a second time, there's more details that are revealed. When you kind of get the bigger picture and you can go back and look at the story with a new perspective. For instance, there's a scene where he calls the number on the back of the box for his one wish willow, which granted him the wish in the first place for the girl of his dreams to be in love with him, even though she very obviously didn't have much interest in him beyond friendship. When he calls that number to try and get any type of help, he gets connected to some sort of customer service line for this One Wish Willow, which I thought what was great about the movie was that it took risks, and one of those ways was making customer service line for something like that isn't something that usually happens in horror films. Usually things are left completely unexplained, but here we had someone who had knowledge of what was going on, and the first question that he ends up asking this customer service rep was, can you alter the wish? Now, this wish that he made, there's a reason why genies and other magical beings in other pieces of media are portrayed with certain sets of rules when it comes to wishes. Like, you can't bring people back to life. You can't um, do anything maybe that like someone wouldn't normally do, and especially you can't make anyone fall in love with you, because something like that, you can't tamper with that. It's not the same as asking for, oh, I want a basketball in my hand right now. Love isn't something that you can force. And instead of, like realizing that and being like, okay, like obviously like this is wrong, like she doesn't actually love me, it's the wish that made it come true, and is forcing this on her. Instead, he asked the customer service rep if he can alter the wish, right? So he's okay with, after finding out that the wish actually worked, because at first he has plausible deniability. Like, who would think that when you wish upon a star or something like that, that it comes true? But upon finding out that it is true, and to him getting a chance to rectify his mistake there, instead of saying, you know what, I want to cancel the wish, this isn't right, I can't take advantage of her like this, he wants to alter it. So he's okay with forcing her to be in love with him against her will. The thing that he's concerned about is all the extra creepy behavior that's coming along with that, that's affecting him. But when it comes to Nikki, he doesn't care about how it affects her. And this is compounded even more by the fact that the customer service rep lets him talk to the real Nikki, and he puts her on the line, as far as we know, and all we hear is screaming, which very obviously tells us, the audience, that whatever is in front of Bear and us, that's not the real Nikki. That's something that replaced her. Now, initially, upon watching this, I was just kind of confused and dumbfounded, and I really thought it was interesting that, like I said, a horror movie kind of went through the lengths of explaining its rules, but upon the second viewing, I realized how truly awful that is, that clear as day, it's put in front of the protagonist that not only has this girl been forced to be in love with him, but something else entirely has taken over her body that's not her at all. And yet he's still, only at the very end of the call, when he's ran out of all of the options, does he ask if he can cancel the wish. But again, only when it seriously affected him. Up to that point, he was perfectly fine with just going with the flow. And that's really the brilliance of the movie, is the writing of the characters, especially the protagonist. Because this movie is a clear example of the fact that protagonist does not always equal good guy or hero. And it's moments like these where the script writing really excels. This is the type of thing that we can take into account when writing our own scripts, right? Because there's a time and a place for everything, right? Some stories call for a standard hero. Others call for something a bit more layered and complex like this. And I guess that's really the main lesson of today's episode, is that stories need complexity. Where you end up putting that complexity, how it's woven into the story, is up to you. But, that's a great example of something that's not just as straightforward as it might seem, or that you might guess from looking at the movie. That's the strength of this movie, is that it wasn't everything that you expected. And that's the insights that Hallie has shared with us today, and that I've expanded upon a little bit afterwards. And It's been really great talking about this movie because I've been enamored with it since I saw it. Well, you know, I was talking about the first 2 times I saw it. I've seen it 3 times. I love it because of things like this, examples of great screenwriting. And I love breaking down things like this for you guys so that we can all learn how to be better writers together. It's been very fun on this episode, and I can't wait to continue this journey with all of you as we continue breaking down our favorite scripts from our favorite movies. Until next time, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this in the future. Have a great night, everyone.